The ghosts of the First World War still loomed heavily over every officer's thoughts as we prepared to march again into the Balkans. Back in 1916, during the blackest days of Verdun and the Somme, Romania had turned the tide in the southeast. It was a knife in the back, encircling the Central Powers and opening another bloody front in the rugged hills of Macedonia. For 2 bitter years, our fathers had bled and died on those mountains, holding the Salonika line, until finally the French broke through with 29 divisions and stormed across the Danube. The memory of that collapse haunted our steps. It was spring, 1941. Once again, British hands were pulling strings in the Balkans, this time Winston Churchill's. He had failed in Gallipoli and again at Salonika, but he remained obsessed with the region. London was assembling an expeditionary force in the Mediterranean and was now shipping it into Greece. By February, Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden and General Sir John Dill were already in Athens, negotiating troop placements with the Greek government. At the same time, the first units of Armeegruppe List had crossed into Romania. They weren't seen as conquerors, far from it. To the Romanians, we were instructors, reinforcements, even protectors. The locals welcomed our arrival warmly. By early February, my unit received its orders, though no one knew where we were headed. We rolled east across the Rhine near Strasbourg and into the heart of southern Germany, through Bohemia, and past the silent spires of Prague. Our train curved south, and by morning we were staring across the Danube at the sprawl of Budapest. From there it was into the wind-blown plains of the Pusta, and toward the Romanian border. We met the Saxons of Transylvania, tough, dignified people whose villages still bore the Gothic pride of the Teutonic Order. Kronstadt, Hermannstadt, and a dozen other names etched in stone and history welcomed us like long-lost kin. I still remember Campulung. The station was once a quiet outpost. Now it heaved with convoys, trucks, crates of fuel, artillery barrels, and helmets gleaming in the mist. The war was alive there. It was in that mud-choked town that I had a moment I would forget until years later. A Romanian lieutenant colonel cursed the axle-deep muck and flagged me down. His small car was stuck. Inside was a woman, her face pale, jaw clenched in pain. I hooked a tow line and dragged the car out without a word. He drove off in haste, and I never gave it another thought. In 1943, on the training grounds of Dobritz, a Romanian colonel found me. His face lit up when he saw me, and he grasped my hands, calling me the man who had saved his wife and son. It took a moment before I realized the woman in that muddy car was on her way to give birth, and had made it just in time. We celebrated the reunion like old friends, and it reminded me that amid the machinery of war, lives still unfolded in silence, far from the front lines. From Campulung, we pushed south toward Bulgaria. The roads, if they could be called that, were hell. Rutted tracks, endless potholes, and sticky black mud clung to our tracks. Tank treads churned the earth into slop. Repair crews worked day and night. We passed villages that seemed frozen in time. A cracked well, a few huts sunk into the soil, crooked fences, chickens roaming like survivors of a storm. Eventually the brown ribbon of the Danube came into view, slow and brooding. Beyond it, through a haze of dust and smoke, we could see the Bulgarian mountains looming like a warning. We crossed on a pontoon bridge built by our engineers. The Bulgarians lined the banks and cheered, some even displaying their faded German medals from the Great War. The warmth of their welcome cut through the chill of the wind. Then came the infamous Shipka Pass, a name etched into the annals of Balkan War. Hairpin turns twisted up the mountain like a coiled snake. One wrong move, and a tank could plunge into a ravine. Recovery teams stood ready, ropes and winches already in place. When the engines failed, Bulgarian peasants brought out their oxen and pulled us forward like it was still 1916. We descended into the Struma Valley, past Sofia, into mountains that swallowed sound and light. The road was little more than a path, a dust-choked artery filled with convoys stretching as far as the eye could see. Artillery pieces, petrol drums, half-tracks, motorcyclists with goggles painted in grit. It was a mechanical beast creeping toward the frontier. The engineers blasted rock and bridged ravines to make new roads, The valley jammed, but within days the blockages cleared. Our assault force was ready. Massive fuel and ammo stockpiles were hidden under canvas or tucked into valleys where the enemy couldn't spot them. Then the Balkans turned again. In Belgrade, anti-German factions, stirred by British agents, seized control overnight. On 26th to 27th March, the government was overthrown. Prince Regent Paul fled. Yugoslavia had signed a pact with the Soviets just hours before, and now it had become an enemy. Hitler's response was instant. The next morning, 6th April 1941, the order was given. Yugoslavia was to be smashed. It was a hot spring evening. The dust in the Struma Valley clung to our boots like ash. The sun had scorched us raw, and yet, just as we thought we were preparing to strike south into Greece, everything changed. With the revolt in Belgrade, we were suddenly redirected north. New orders arrived. We were to march toward the Yugoslavian border near Kustendil, a forgotten town now thrust into the center of a wider war. The 9th Panzer Division had already reached Kustendil and was preparing to strike northwest toward Skopje, a key road junction. Our regiment, the Leibstandarte, would follow closely behind. But rather than turn north, we would swing south after Prilep and punch into Greece from behind. It was a bold plan, timed to catch both Yugoslav and British forces off guard. By nightfall, I had assembled my reinforced battalion into formation. The men stood silently, the glow of cigarettes like fireflies beneath their helmets. I briefed them under the darkening sky, detailing the enemy positions, the objectives, the road ahead. The air was still and heavy. No one spoke. Each man was alone with his thoughts. Many were young, barely more than boys. Yet when I spoke of the First World War, of our fathers bleeding in the Balkan mud, of the price we had once paid at Monastery and the Black Mountains of Macedonia, I saw something stir in them. Not fear, not pride, something older, understanding. We were not marching into the unknown, we were marching into history. The road twisted upward in the silver light of the moon. The white gravel track curled along the bare slopes of the frontier mountains, snaking toward the sky. Somewhere up ahead were Yugoslav pillboxes and dragon's teeth. We would hit them before sunrise. At dawn, the 9th Panzer Division's vanguard smashed into the enemy's border defenses. At 1,200 meters, their 88mm flak guns and anti-tank pieces opened up. The silence shattered as concrete bunkers were blown apart in thunderous blasts. Smoke hung like curtains over the ridgelines. Through the rising mist, the red sun bled into the eastern sky, and tracer rounds hissed across the mountain flanks like threads of fire. Then came the planes. Yugoslav aircraft swept low from the west, diving into the valley and bombing the roads and columns behind us. Kustendil took several hits, though damage was minor. One of our own, SS Obersturmbannführer Monke, commander of the 2nd Battalion, Leibstandarte, was wounded in the attack. Command passed to SS Hauptsturmführer Baum. We reached the shattered border by late afternoon. The pillboxes had been silenced, their entrances blown open and bunkers charred inside. Prisoners were already streaming past us, tired men with dirt-blackened hands and empty eyes. Many were Volksdeutsche, Banat and Bachka Germans, conscripted into the Yugoslav army. When they saw our uniforms, they wept and shouted, shaking our hands like brothers returned from exile. Corpses of horses lay bloated in the heat, tongues black and distended. Others stood dazed on the roadsides, their reins still tied to nothing. The landscape had changed. Mountains faded behind us. The terrain opened into plains dotted with abandoned armor, burnt-out trucks, and the shattered remnants of a retreating army. We advanced through Kumanevo in darkness, the village barely visible in the dying light. The ruins and fresh graves told the tale. The 9th Panzer had fought bitterly here before moving on. We were ordered to take the lead. Our objective, to push past Prilep and strike into Greece from the south. Just after midnight, we reached the last outposts of the 9th Panzer. The sky was black. A single crescent moon hung over the hills like a blade. Ahead lay no man's land. I gathered Untersturmführer Waworzinek and his advance guard. I placed my hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Boys, the night belongs to the good soldier." He smiled. They mounted their motorcycles, and in silence they rode into the dark. Their machines hummed into the hills, slow at first, then faster, chasing the road like wolves. Moments later, the sound of rifle fire cracked in the distance. The Yugoslavs were still holding out on the high ground. I followed behind with the second wave. Bullets zipped past like insects. Our column came under fire just beneath a low ridge. We pushed forward anyway. Our armored cars spat tracers into the tree line, lighting up silhouettes of enemy infantry scrambling away. At the edge of a small village, the Kradschützen swept in. Within minutes, over 100 stunned Yugoslav soldiers surrendered. Their officers raged at their own men, furious that their outer defences hadn't delayed us longer. Our interpreter calmly explained that we had bypassed them entirely. Their mountains were behind us. We were already deep into their territory. The operation had begun. By dawn, we rolled into the outskirts of Prilep. Rain had started to fall, a thin, persistent drizzle that turned the roads into thick grey soup. The dust from yesterday mixed with the water to form a glutinous mud that sucked at our boots and bogged down our bikes. The village was quiet. We'd linked up with the forward elements of the 73rd Infantry Division. Their steel-helmeted soldiers slouched along the hedgerows or resting beside their field kitchens. I recognized their battalion commander at once, Major Stiefvater, a calm, thoughtful man I had once trained beside at Mühlhausen. We clasped hands like old brothers. He had come from the east and reached Prilep with minimal losses. That day, we allowed ourselves a brief pause, a few hours of rest beneath the dripping skies. The men dropped their gear and stretched out wherever they could, some falling asleep on sacks of ammunition, others lying flat in the cold mud without a word. Our tanks steamed from the wet, their engines ticking in the quiet. Horses chewed at feed bags, their ribs sharp against canvas. I walked the column, checking on the men. They were exhausted, but not broken. We had farther to go. Monastery was our next target. I had studied the maps the night before. The road to Monastery was open ground. No forests, no mountain cover. Just flat stretches of Balkan plain, with the looming outline of high peaks in the distance. Those peaks were the gateway to Greece. I could feel the weight of history on our backs. Our fathers had bled for this place in the Great War, and now it was our turn. The rain stopped just after noon. A weak sun broke through the cloud cover. We saddled up again and rolled out. The advance was cautious at first, then bold. Somewhere south of Prilep, as we crested a ravine, we spotted a strange blur of movement down the trail. A Yugoslav artillery column, still moving, still unaware of our approach. We didn't hesitate. The Kradschützen surged forward like wolves released from the leash. Motorcycles weaved through the ravine at full throttle. Our armored cars barreled down behind them, 2-centimeter cannon barrels leveled and ready. Yugoslav gunners shouted in confusion, some dropping their shells mid-load, others trying to limber their guns and flee. Within minutes, it was over. The scene became chaos. Teams scattering, equipment overturned. I saw one man trying to lead a horse-drawn gun off the road, only for the carriage to collapse sideways into a gully. A loud crack followed, the gun's trail split in two. The entire battery was captured or destroyed. One of my NCOs, grinning, called it our fastest victory yet. We didn't stop. The pace was relentless. By nightfall, we were closing in on Monastery. The old name clung to it, even as the maps now called it Bitola. In the First War, it had cost thousands of lives. This time, we would take it by surprise. Before we pushed forward, I gathered the company commanders under a stand of dead trees. The pale moon hung low, casting thin beams through the clouded mist. The wind had picked up and carried the distant echo of gunfire, probably from the 9th Panzer Division still pressing towards Skopje. We didn't have artillery cover for this assault. It would be speed and aggression. I knelt beside Untersturmführer Warzinek again. His men were like ghosts in the dark, silent, alert, soaked to the bone, but wired with anticipation. I looked him in the eyes and said only, "Take it like your father never could." At dawn, the motorcycles moved first, through villages and empty farmsteads, over swollen creeks and across half-frozen tracks. We advanced on the city from the northeast. Resistance was light. Yugoslav defenders were falling back in disorder, unaware of how quickly we had closed the distance. In one skirmish outside a vineyard, we came under fire from a low ridge, while Warzinek's men dismounted instantly, moving like shadows through the vine rows. One grenade, 2 bursts of MG fire, and it was done. They left 5 Yugoslav bodies on the hill and took 3 more alive. The prisoners looked stunned, one of them no older than 17. We swept into Monastery just before mid-morning. The city was eerily quiet. Flags of the old kingdom still hung limp over government buildings. We moved through the streets cautiously, clearing intersections and alleyways. But the city offered no fight. Its garrison had fled south, retreating toward the Greek border. We'd taken the town without a serious engagement. The men cheered in relief. I did not. The hard part was still to come. By the time we had secured Monastery, the wind had shifted. There was a strange electricity in the air, a sense that history was folding in on itself. We had captured the city in a matter of hours, a place that had taken thousands of Austro-Hungarian and German lives in the First World War. But we had no time to linger. Orders came down within the hour. We were to strike south toward the Greek frontier immediately. The enemy was on the run, yes, but not beaten, not yet. The road to Greece was a winding vein through the Balkans, flanked by mountains, scattered with broken villages, and patrolled by enemy stragglers. The weather turned again. Rain fell steadily, coating the rocks with a slick sheen and turning the narrow paths into death traps for vehicles. Even our tracked transports skidded at every hairpin. We were no longer riding on paved surfaces but creeping forward along the backbone of the Balkans, through mountain ridges carved by time and war. We passed charred tree lines, old First War bunkers, and the graves of men long forgotten. In the valleys below, the farms looked abandoned. Dogs barked in the distance, and flocks of birds burst from trees at the sound of our engines. That afternoon, I rode beside an SS Sturman named Köhler. He was barely 19, from Pomerania, and he'd never seen a mountain in his life. He looked at the clouds clawing the peaks and muttered, "It feels like we're riding into an old god's tomb." I didn't disagree. Our scouts reported light resistance ahead, isolated Yugoslav units digging in around the border, hoping to slow our advance. At dusk, Wawrzyniec's Kradschützen found a small enemy detachment near a river crossing. They approached silently under cover of a pine grove and opened fire from 30 meters. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. 5 Yugoslavs dead, 7 captured, 2 wounded. None of ours fell. The prisoners looked terrified. Some wore old French gear, others British surplus. One of them, speaking broken German, begged for his life and said the war was over for him. I gave him water and handed him off to the rear column. By nightfall, we reached the last slope before the Greek border. The path was narrow, with steep drops on either side, and the dense smell of wet pine in the air. It reminded some of the Ardennes, but this was older land, wilder, steeped in forgotten blood. We bivouacked on the ridge. The men lit no fires. They slept in soaked blankets and ate cold rations, eyes always on the tree line. A fog rolled in from the south, swallowing the world in grey. I walked the perimeter in silence, boots crunching wet gravel. At around 3 a.m., a runner came to me breathless, his face pale. "Enemy on the trail," he whispered. "They're blocking the pass." I gathered the officers at once and explained the plan. We would strike just before first light, use the fog to our advantage, and force them out before they could set proper ambushes. Just before dawn, I stood with Wawrzyniec again. His men were ghosts, camouflaged and coiled to strike. I gripped his shoulder and said, "Fast and hard, no mercy. We break them now, or they break us in the pass." What followed was a whirlwind of violence. The fog broke with the first rifle crack. Our men stormed forward, bayonets fixed, MGs barking from behind tree stumps and boulders. The Yugoslavs opened up from a high ridge, but their fire went wide in the low visibility. One of our armoured cars broke through on the lower path and hosed the ridge with 20mm shells. Trees splintered, bodies tumbled. Our grenadiers moved in with silent fury. I saw an SS Rottenführer named Bergmann take a bullet in the thigh, but crawl forward, dragging himself behind a log, and still fire his MP-40 until the ridge was ours. I heard later he was awarded the Iron Cross for that action. We pushed them back. By 7:30, the pass was open. Our men advanced with momentum now, the border looming just ahead. We crossed into Greek territory not with trumpets or fanfare, but with the mud of Macedonia on our boots and the blood of Balkan resistance still drying on our sleeves. From the summit, I looked back across the vast northern plains. Smoke rose in the far distance, burning farms, shattered outposts, the bones of a campaign we had ripped through in days, not weeks. It wasn't glory that I felt, it was gravity. The weight of what we'd done, what we were still going to do, pressed into my chest like a millstone. The Balkans were behind us, Greece lay ahead, and the war rolled on. We had followed the twisting track for hours when we finally saw it, steel glinting through the drizzle, arches rising proud above the current. The bridge across the Zrna. It hadn't been blown yet. I could feel my heartbeat pick up. That bridge was everything. We couldn't afford to let it fall. 2 of our armoured cars peeled out of the column like wolves scenting prey. Their 20mm cannons barked, sending rounds across the river, aiming for the far bank where trucks and horse-drawn carriages had begun to panic and bunch up. The Yugoslavs were trying to flee, fighting each other for a chance to escape. Chaos, absolute chaos. We were less than 100 meters away, and I could taste victory already. Just a few more seconds, I thought, just a few more meters, but then it happened. A muffled thump, like the breath of a dying beast, rolled across the valley. The steel arches lifted before our eyes, shuddered, and collapsed into themselves. Men, horses, wagons, all of it was hurled into the river below, swallowed by the churning waters of the Zrna. Our MGs opened up instinctively, chewing into the wreckage and any stragglers on the other side. But it was over. The bridge was gone. I stood there in stunned silence, then anger, then a cold acceptance. Kras came up beside me, surveying the wreckage with the same grim look. We didn't have time to grieve what could have been. The enemy couldn't be allowed to regroup. By some miracle, the twisted metal of the collapsed bridge still jutted above the surface. Our engineers were already moving. Grenadiers scrambled across the wreckage under cover fire, securing a fragile toehold on the far bank. Beams, ropes, and salvaged planks were hauled over by hand. Everyone helped. Drivers, messengers, even wounded men. It reminded me of training back in Germany, except this was no drill. Our lives depended on that crossing. Motorcycles were the first across. Scouts disappeared into the distance toward Monastery, and as the makeshift bridge grew plank by plank, the first heavy armoured cars rolled across, the wood groaning beneath their weight. The advance was alive again. Kras's second company was put back at the head of the spear. We followed a railway line that ran parallel to the road, and behind its embankment Yugoslav riflemen took potshots at us. Most of them were poorly armed, barely delaying us at all. The armoured cars answered with bursts of MG fire, clearing the brush. The embankment began curving toward the road, crossing it just ahead. Our lead section halted. Grenadiers dismounted and spread into the ditches. An enemy machine gun opened up from a linesman's shack. It had to go. Our 50mm anti-tank gun was hauled forward under fire, set up, and let loose. 2 rounds. The shack exploded like dry kindling. But the brief stop had emboldened the enemy. Fire from the embankment intensified. We needed to clear it, fast. The armoured cars laid down covering fire while our grenadiers stormed up the slope. The survivors scattered into the swamp. Just as I was mounting Unterscharführer Weil's motorcycle, new fire sent us diving back into the ditch. Bullets tore through the grass around us. I heard a wet gargle and turned. Weil's face was a mess of blood, his jaw shattered. He squirmed in the mud, dying silently. There was no time to mourn. We were too close to Monastery. We had to break through before they pinned us at the gates. I gave the signal. The Kradschützen leapt onto their bikes like circus riders and surged forward. The battalion followed like iron filings to a magnet. The rain stopped. Sunlight cracked through the clouds. Ahead, tracer fire lit up the haystacks. Flames leapt high as if signalling our arrival. Monastery lay nestled in the valley below, ringed by mountains, a jewel we had to seize. Enemy guns tried to set up on a hill to the right, but we ignored them. No time, no mercy. The roadblock ahead burst apart under our fire. Hand grenades arced through the air. The defenders barely had time to register what was happening before we were on them. We didn't attack like a conventional army, we struck like a dagger. The battalion pushed into Monastery in column, weaving between rubble and enemy fire, backed by our armoured cars. Machine guns sprayed every window, doors were kicked in, resistance flared, then fell. I saw the barracks ahead. That was the heart of their defense. Everything led there. Bullets whipped past us from rooftops and gardens. 2 heavy infantry guns were brought up under fire and lobbed their 150mm shells straight into the compound. After 20 minutes it was over. Monastery was ours, except for the train station. Some diehards holed up there, but our pioneers cleared them out within the hour. We rounded up prisoners by the dozens, shell-shocked and glassy-eyed. An entire artillery battalion surrendered without firing a shot, but there was no time to rest. Reports flooded in. Serbs at Lake Okrida, British forces pushing into Florina. We were alone in the city and couldn't expect backup for another day. I had no choice. We had to split and keep moving. I gave Kras the impossible task: force the Javat Pass, make contact with the Italians west of Florina. Schroeder was sent to shadow the British around the Klidi Pass and prevent any breakout. Both men stared at me like I'd gone mad. Maybe I had. Still, they obeyed. Kras moved out into the mountains. Soon he captured a Yugoslav battery hiding in an orchard. By midnight he was already below the Javat heights. Scouts said the pass was fortified. He would have to fight uphill. Meanwhile, Schroeder sent word from Florina and Vevi. He had a strange story. While scouting in the night, his men had unknowingly passed 2 British recon cars. Neither side recognized the other until they'd driven past. The Brits must have thought they were Serbs. Half an hour later, those same recon cars drove straight into our trap. We found detailed maps on them, positions, minefields, all of it. Schroeder stayed aggressive and pinned them in place with skirmishes and clever deception. They had no idea how thin our line was. At dawn, I joined Kras for the assault. The road was hell, hairpins, ravines, cliffs. Attacking with a single reinforced company seemed suicidal, but the element of surprise was ours. Through the morning mist, the first salvos from our infantry guns crashed into the ridgeline. 150mm shells echoed like thunder through the mountains. Tracer fire clawed upward like glowing chains. By then, our motorcyclists had become mountaineers. They climbed the slopes by night, flanking the enemy, bypassing strong points, creeping into positions from the rear. When the final charge came, it was over fast. We took the ridge. Prisoners poured down from the heights. Whole batteries gave up without firing a shot. I found Kras beside a stone chapel, smoke still curling from the battlefield behind us. He looked exhausted, but alive. I shook his hand. A Serbian officer explained it all to us. When my men heard the Germans had already taken Monastery and would reach us by nightfall, he said, they lost the will to fight. Your bomb throwers did the rest. From the summit, we looked out over the shining blue of Lake Okrida. Florina glittered below. It had to be taken before the enemy realized their pass defenders were gone. We had no motorcycles left, only armored cars, but that would be enough. We descended the pass with engines growling and guns loaded, ready to strike again. The war would not wait, neither would we. The summer sun over the Balkan mountains was deceptive. Warmth clung to the valleys, but in the heights the weather changed as quickly as fate. What began as a dry and cloudless afternoon soon gave way to mist, rainfall, and then a sudden bitter cold that swept across the ridgelines like a ghost. Snow settled over the slopes as night fell, and with it came the silence of men preparing for battle. Dug into crude foxholes hacked into the frozen mountain earth, the men of the I Battalion of the Infantry Brigade Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler waited, soaked through, their uniforms stiffening into ice. Somewhere above them in the night, a vastly superior enemy force, British and Greek troops, held the summit, fortified and dug in. The Germans had no winter coats, no blankets, no relief. They had only rifles, grenades, and the desperate will to press forward. The wind howled through the heights, and the ground itself seemed to freeze their very souls. At dawn on August 12th, the mountain exploded. A sudden scream of shells tore through the misty stillness as the German artillery began its barrage. Heavy anti-aircraft guns were turned downward, firing directly into the slopes to suppress enemy fire. Mortars and field guns followed, sending earth and debris skyward. And then the Sturmgeschütze came. Rumbling from the valley below, the assault guns began their improbable ascent. Their crews had studied the maps, and knew the terrain was considered impassable, but the guns kept moving, treads grinding against the rocky incline, mud and ice shearing off their flanks. To the astonishment of all watching, they kept climbing higher and higher until the dark hulls joined the battle, their cannons speaking with thunder into the smoke-covered heights. Among those observing was an officer positioned at a scissors telescope. From his vantage point, he watched as the first company of the brigade, led by SS Obersturmführer Gerd Pleiss, charged forward into the storm. The British had laid deep defences, with machine gun nests layered across the terrain, and mortars positioned to rain death upon any approach. But the German infantry moved quickly and with fury, bounding from crater to crater, snow and mud splashing around them, smoke and steel howling in every direction. In the chaos, British prisoners began stumbling downhill. Shell-shocked and wide-eyed, many were strong men, professional soldiers from New Zealand and the United Kingdom. Their faces told the story: defeat, disbelief, exhaustion. They had been shaken by the precision and violence of the German bombardment, but there was no time to rest. Farther up the slope, German combat engineers crept into the minefields to carve a path for armour. All the while, the infantry fought tooth and nail, dislodging defenders position by position, clearing bunkers with hand grenades and bayonets. At one of these points, tragedy struck. SS Sturmbannführer Witt stood quietly beside the mangled corpse of his younger brother Franz. The boy had tried to navigate through a minefield to support the assault, but was blown apart in the attempt. The snow around him was red, yet the momentum carried forward. Pleiss was wounded, but pressed on, personally directing his men as they fought just beneath the summit. The assault guns had reached their limit. Now it was down to the grenadiers. Grenades arced into British nests. Smoke columns spiraled. At such close range, no commands were shouted. Everything was instinct. Each position was cleared by brutal, intimate combat. Rifles fired from the hip, knives drawn in the trenches, hands frozen to steel. Eventually, the summit was taken. The British defenders surrendered in clusters. The men of Company Place had captured over 100 prisoners, 20 machine guns, and a range of other supplies. Gerd Pleiss remained at the front, bleeding, but still issuing orders. The pass into Greece had been opened, but the battle did not stop. The enemy, withdrawing in haste, tried to regroup south of the pass. British and Greek armour surged forward, supported by aircraft. The German vanguard had outpaced its own armoured support. At one moment, British tanks broke through and began firing directly into the Leibstandarte's lead companies. Men scrambled for cover. Then, from behind a ridge, SS Obersturmführer Dr. Naumann arrived with two 88mm flak guns. The teams sprang into action with trained efficiency. Range was called, targets marked, and the cannons opened fire. The thunder of high-velocity shells echoed off the mountains. One British tank erupted into flames, then another. In minutes, the advance had been shattered. Fire and ruin littered the pass. The enemy was repulsed. To the north, the 9th Panzer Division pushed deeper into Greek territory, while German reconnaissance elements moved toward Lake Kastoria. The road ahead narrowed into tight bends between towering cliffs and deep ravines. At the base of the Klissura Pass, the terrain rose sharply, and the peaks looked as if they would crush the columns below. 2 ridges were seized within 30 minutes, but the danger was only beginning. As the vehicles wound higher, the led motorcyclists discovered the bridge ahead had been blown. Rubble spilled into the ravine, the road was severed, yet once again there was no immediate fire. Suspicion grew. Was it abandoned, or were they being watched? Cautiously, the lead platoon crept forward to secure the far side of the bridge. No sooner had they crossed the debris when machine guns opened up from hidden positions. Bullets zipped past the engineers. Mortars began landing in the ravine. The Germans were trapped, unable to advance, unable to retreat. The only path forward was through. With no mountain troops available, the armoured reconnaissance battalion now had to act as infantry. As night fell, engineers began the painstaking work of building a provisional crossing. Explosives were used to blast rubble into place. Men hauled boulders by hand. Gun crews and radio operators became labourers. The pass echoed with the crash of rock and shouted orders. By midnight, a crude bridge stood. Anti-tank guns began to cross. Then came the final assault. 2 motorcycle companies, now dismounted, were ordered to climb the massif. It would be 800 meters of vertical combat. These men, trained for speed and mobility, now climbed like mountain troops. Separated by the ravine, each company ascended independently, relying on intuition and aggression. The road assault group, led by a 30-man detachment with armored cars, flak guns, and reconnaissance equipment, moved along the narrow cliffside. Darkness blanketed everything. The moon had vanished, and the silence was eerie. The enemy was above them, watching. At the final bend in the road, where the mountains crested and dropped down toward Lake Castoria, Major Kras halted the advance. Something felt wrong. A sense of unseen danger hung heavy in the air. The men were freezing, their uniforms were soaked, and the high-altitude wind made every breath burn. Shivering violently, many silently sat with backs pressed to the rock wall. Others smoked in silence, the glow of cigarettes briefly illuminating exhausted faces. In a radio truck, Kras studied the map again, nerves fraying with every tick of the signal. Beep, beep, beep. He stepped outside. The air was cold, but something else was gripping him. It wasn't just the cold, it was fear. He bit down on his chattering teeth. No man dared speak of it, but all felt it. Shortly before dawn, a dispatch rider, SS Kradschützen John, arrived with a field report. His unit had reached the enemy's flank undetected. John's head was bandaged from a grazing bullet, but he remained calm. His voice was steady. He took a swig from a medic's flask and disappeared again into the shadows. The plan was simple. Once the first 88 fired, all three groups would attack simultaneously, from the road, from the left ridge, and from the right. As first light crept over the peaks, the village silhouette appeared. Kras gave the order. Naumann's 88 roared. The opening shot shattered the morning silence. Within seconds, the ridge erupted in a cacophony of fire. Mortars, machine guns, and grenades poured into the Greek defences. Overhead, the dismounted motorcycle troops surged over the rocks, rifles blazing, grenades clutched in gloved hands. They struck the Greek lines from both flanks, yelling, firing, climbing. The mountains became a furnace. In the narrow road bend below, heavy guns barked, the ground trembled, and the echoes of battle rolled across the peaks. They were no longer simply reconnaissance troops. They were mountain soldiers now, and they would not be stopped. The narrow mountain road wound like a snake along the ridgeline, with sheer rock on one side and a deadly drop on the other. Vehicle after vehicle inched forward, but there was no room to dig in artillery positions or anchor trail spades. When ordered to fire, the battery commander hesitated, worried, indecisive, afraid to take responsibility for unleashing such destruction on an unstable position. But there was no time for excuses. The enemy had to be hit now. A furious command broke through the wind, fire. A moment later, the heavy guns recoiled and thundered into life. The shells soared over the mountain ridge and exploded in the heart of the Greek positions around the village ahead. The rocks trembled. Shards of stone tumbled down the slope, skipping like bullets past the Germans. Machine gun fire began to snap and whip down the road, kicking up dust and fragments. There was only one way through, forward. With heads low and rifles ready, the Germans surged from one crag to the next in short bursts, always ducking into the next patch of cover, every movement measured against the risk of sniper fire. At each bend in the road, the hill above loomed larger. The enemy had the height. 100 meters above, a full reinforced infantry regiment was entrenched across the Greek left flank, guarding the Klissura Pass, an essential retreat corridor for the battered Greek Third Corps pulling back from the Albanian front. The Germans were exhausted, breathless, soaked in sweat, their boots caked in mud and dust. And yet, above them, the battle raged like a thunderstorm. From the ridgeline, the sounds of hand grenades, shouts, and machine gun bursts echoed downward. The 2nd Company of the SS Reconnaissance Battalion had reached the first line of enemy bunkers. They were in. At the final large bend before the summit, a small detachment of men crouched near the edge. They had become separated from their company during the ascent, cut off by a crevasse. One of them, SS Untersturmführer Emil Waworzinek, offered a quick, urgent briefing. Prisoners had confirmed that the entire flank was manned by a major Greek formation, reinforced, well-armed, and ordered to hold the pass at all costs. If the Germans failed here, the entire Greek Third Corps would escape and regroup with British forces farther south. That could not be allowed to happen. They pressed forward, moving inch by inch along the shattered road, but suddenly the ground convulsed. A thunderous explosion ripped the path apart just meters ahead. Where a road had been seconds earlier, there was now a smouldering crater the size of a house. Dust rained down. No one moved. Fear clawed at every man. Were they next? Another blast. Another section of road vanished into the ravine. The column froze. Machine guns opened up again. Bullets hissed past and slapped into the rocks. No one could move. Wawzinek hesitated. The advance stalled. Then, in a moment of raw desperation, one officer reached into his tunic, pulled out a stick grenade, ripped the pin, and casually rolled it behind the last man in the squad. The explosion was harmless, but the shock it delivered was electric. As if stung by fire, the men surged forward, leaping over rock, bounding into the crater, breaking through their paralysis. They laughed and cursed as the madness set in. The spell of fear was broken. The assault was back on. Above, the summit had become a hellscape. Clouds of dirt and fire burst around the German 88mm cannons, yet they fired relentlessly. The high-velocity shells were blowing whole bunkers apart, collapsing trenches and showering the peaks in shrapnel. Resistance was buried under landslides of rock. Just beneath the top, the Germans gave everything. Sweat streamed into eyes, mouths, open wounds. With dust in their lungs and earth on their teeth, they charged one final time. Screams erupted from the Greek positions. Panic set in. White flags appeared. Some defenders simply stood, arms raised, dazed and disarmed by the ferocity of the attack. Others were still trying to fire, but machine guns from the summit were now pinning them from above. Their retreat had been cut off. The German grenadiers closed the final pocket with bayonets and hand grenades. The mountain battery was silenced. The Klissura Pass was theirs. No rest, no pause. The attack had to be turned into a pursuit. The engineers set to work, blasting rock into the craters and patching the broken road, while artillery rolled into new positions to fire into the retreating Greeks. The enemy's collapse was total. Pockets of brave resistance still held out and fought to the death, but they were isolated. Over 1,000 prisoners were taken in a single day, including a full regimental commander and 3 battalion officers. Now the Germans could see what they had won. From the heights of the Klissura Pass, the enemy retreat lay exposed in the valley below. Roads clogged with men, wagons, and vehicles were now under direct German artillery and machine gun fire. It was the perfect place for annihilation. But the road down was booby-trapped and unstable. More explosions ripped the descent apart. Every delay was precious time lost. The second company began to push cautiously into a small village, hoping to regroup. There, they awaited the arrival of the first company. But when the young men of that unit appeared, their eyes were hollow, their boots dragging. They carried the remains of their company commander, Rudolf Schröder, wrapped in a blood-soaked tarp. His chest had been torn open by enemy fire during the first breakthrough on the ridge. He had led from the front, and he had died that way. By late afternoon, the reconnaissance detachment had reached the plain below and advanced toward Kastoria. The land opened up. The distant hills were covered in olive groves, but the war was not done. Approaching a small bridge, the Germans slowed. The far side was silent. The bridge appeared intact, but as they moved cautiously forward, gunfire erupted. One bullet struck Franz Roth, the embedded war correspondent. His skull was torn open. He screamed only once. A pool of blood spread beneath his body. Nightfall came, and the second company reached the bridge. They formed a bridgehead on the far side, reconnoitering the terrain north of Lake Kastoria. Resistance stiffened again. The next objective loomed, Hill 800. At dawn, the assault began. But this time, the Greeks were ready. Their artillery was heavier, more accurate. A direct hit collapsed the bridge behind the Germans. They lay in the mud, dazed, clutching at helmets and rifles, unable to believe the ferocity of the barrage. The mountain shook. A sudden assault would not work. A coordinated attack was required. By midday, fresh forces from the 3rd Battalion of the Leibstandarte arrived. With the support of heavy artillery, the flank attack was planned. To break the stronghold on Hill 800, Dive bombers were called in. The Stukas arrived like hawks falling from the sky. Their engines howled as they spiraled down in formation, sirens wailing, bomb hatches open. One after another they dropped their loads. The mountain exploded. Towers of dust and rock shot upward, mushrooming into the sunlit air. The blasts merged into a single rolling roar of violence that echoed across the lake. It was the apocalypse made visible. As the final bombs fell, the SS reconnaissance troops stormed up the hillside, lungs burning, boots slipping on blasted earth. The 80s joined in, precise, brutal, relentless. Resistance collapsed. Those not killed by the bombing were buried, wounded, or stunned. By the time the Germans reached the summit, it was over. The other companies poured into Kastoria through the shattered bridge. Greek units, still retreating from the mountains, stumbled straight into captivity. Entire batteries surrendered without firing a shot. Some didn't even realize they were surrounded. The German armored cars rolled into the town square as though in a parade. In the center, the village priest waited. He approached the officer in command and embraced him. It was a moment of strange calm after weeks of chaos. The air reeked of garlic and gunpowder, but there was no rest. The northern roads were still open. More Greek units were retreating from battles with Italian forces and filtering into the town. Thunderclouds rolled overhead. Explosions still echoed. The sky cracked with lightning and artillery. Exhausted beyond words, the men fell asleep where they stood. Only at dawn did they realize the scale of their victory. In 24 hours, the SS Reconnaissance Battalion had taken 12,000 prisoners and captured 36 field guns. Their commander was awarded the Knight's Cross. The fighting was not yet over. The Metzavon Pass still had to be taken. The remnants of the Greek army continued to resist, but the end was near. On April 21st, in the town of Larissa, 16 Greek divisions signed their surrender. 3 days later, the order came: pursue the British. The men had barely slept. Their vehicles were refueled from captured Greek stores. The mosques and minarets of Joannina stood quiet. No one bothered to collect the discarded Greek weapons left leaning against mosque walls or stacked in courtyards. The Greek soldiers simply shaved their beards, slung fresh bread and fish on sticks, and wandered south, resigned, defeated, and strangely at peace. The road south became a river of confusion. Herdsmen, soldiers, colonels with trumpeters, civilians, and stragglers poured through the valleys. It was the final image of a disintegrating army. Discipline had collapsed, but pride remained. The victors pressed on in silence. Soon they would reach the Gulf of Arta. And somewhere ahead, the British waited. We had survived the 250-kilometer trek across mountainous terrain, with our motorcycles slipping along washed-out roads and crumbling paths. Now, we stood facing the jagged peaks of the Peloponnesus. On the far side of the Gulf of Corinth, somewhere amid the dark ridges and crumbling cliffs, the last British columns were retreating southward toward the ports. We had no radio contact with the regiment, no orders, no reinforcements, just the silence of the sea and the rumble of distant aircraft. High above, British reconnaissance planes circled like vultures, scanning the coastline and harbours below. Across the Gulf, the port city of Patras was choked with smoke and vessels. Through our binoculars, we could see the silhouettes of destroyers and transport ships, including one Royal Navy vessel turning south at full speed. We knew what that meant. The British were pulling out. We had been following the trail left behind by British demolition teams. Bridges collapsed, tunnels sealed, roads cratered by explosives. We crept south along the coastal route, pushing toward the Isthmus of Corinth. But something had changed in me. This pursuit no longer felt like war. It was a chase that always arrived too late. I had started to feel that all I would gain from this campaign was experience in repairing roads. The British were always gone when we got there. But the mountains across the Gulf, those drew my eye more and more. From our position, we could see the coastal highway where the British were escaping westward. They were heading from Corinth to Patras, hoping to reach the evacuation points. If we could get across that water, we might cut them off. But how? I found myself standing on the ancient mole at Navpaktos, a lonely and crumbling harbour protected by medieval towers and battered stones. That's when I heard the roar of Stuka engines. A formation of dive bombers plummeted down over Patras, and moments later, black columns of smoke erupted from the harbour. Bombs landed among the clustered ships. Chaos broke out. And then, by pure chance, I saw an old telephone line running into the wall of a port building. I picked up the receiver. It worked. The line was live. I tried Patras, and someone answered. I replaced the handset, stunned. But the idea took root in my mind. If the line worked, why not ask for a situation report? I summoned our interpreter and ordered him to ring the Greek commander in Patras. Still shaken by the bombing raid, the officer on the other end responded immediately, rattling off positions and troop numbers without hesitation. In minutes, we had a clear picture of British movements between Corinth and Patras. I asked him to dispatch a liaison party to Navpaktos, and to my amazement, a small motorboat soon appeared, chugging toward us from across the gulf. But just then, another wave of Stukas descended upon Patras. As they banked to return north, the German pilots, clearly unaware of our coordination, strafed the very motorboat carrying the Greek liaison officer. The boat swerved and turned back immediately. Moments later, I received a call. The officer was furious and declared no one would be crossing under these circumstances. I stood, sweating into my map. It was outdated, stained, and mostly useless. But the broader picture was clear. We were closing in. Athens had likely fallen or would soon fall. The Isthmus of Corinth was now the British bottleneck. If we could land a force behind their retreat, we might shatter what remained of their rear guard. But questions loomed. Had British intelligence spotted our movements? Were ships waiting to shell any crossing? Could paratroopers seize the isthmus before we got there? There were no answers, just silence. The men watched me from the mole, quiet, tense, waiting. More than 15 kilometers of open water lay between us and our goal. I paced the dock, calculating over and over. I made the decision. I would act. No orders, no clearance. I would cross the Gulf of Corinth on my own authority. Whether it was daring or madness, history would decide later. My men were already nodding. Some raised eyebrows. Others began unpacking gear. Engineers warned me the artillery couldn't support us, that the waves were too high, that the boats were unsuitable. They were right, but it didn't matter. We located 2 miserable fishing cutters, their hulls cracked, their decks slick with salt and fish oil. The crews were summoned. Our motorcycles, BMWs with sidecars, were hoisted into the boats by sheer manpower. On the first cutter, 5 bikes, 15 men. On the second, an anti-tank gun and more motorcycles. The mission was simple: land, block the coastal road, and if overwhelmed, vanish into the mountains. As the boats pushed off into the Gulf, I shook hands with Hugo Krass and Sturmbannführer Grezek. Someone joked, calling them a suicide patrol. Another shouted back, "Mine to port," and laughter broke the tension. A young soldier leaned from the bow and answered, "A mine? This boat isn't even worth a grenade spray drenched the gunners at the front." Waves slammed the hull. The anti-tank guns swayed ominously. One by one, the rest of the company boarded the waiting craft. The boats became tiny black specks on the silver water. I stood alone on the marina, watching. A red flare was the agreed signal. Mission failed. Heavy resistance ahead. My uniform clung to me with sweat. My eyes burned from staring through binoculars. I waited. 1 hour passed. Then another. Cigarettes burned down to the filter. Then, finally, 2 dots appeared on the horizon. Were they ours? Were they survivors? Or wreckage being returned? Closer movement could be seen, shadows on the deck. And then a staff car skidded to a stop beside me. Sepp Dietrich leapt out, eyes wild, fists clenched. Before I could speak, he exploded. "Are you insane? Who gave you the right to send my men across the Gulf in rowboats? I should have you court-martialed on the spot." I stood frozen. There was no reply I could give that would matter. Around us, a circle of men watched in silence. Some smiled faintly, almost proudly. They knew what had happened. The boats pulled up to the dock, packed with men and prisoners. More men were returning than had gone. British soldiers, captured on the far shore, no shots fired. Dietrich turned. Not another word was said. All hesitation vanished. More boats were loaded. The battalion would cross tonight. My driver, Petersilia, had chilled a bottle of sparkling wine in the harbour water and handed it to me as a joke. I clutched it under my arm and joined Dietrich and the captured British officers beneath the shade of an olive tree. One of them raised his glass and toasted his sister's birthday. We drank like pirates, ragged and sleepless, not fit for any ceremony. Then I climbed into one of the cursed skiffs. Within minutes, I was seasick. But we made it across. On the far shore, I found Company Kras. Exhausted, but successful. They had seized vehicles, scouted the area around Corinth, and secured contact with the town commander at Patras. Grezek had directed larger vessels to the crossing point. The final British units were gone, slipping south into the Peloponnesian wilderness. That afternoon, a Luftwaffe scout reported a full enemy regiment moving along the coastal road. We scrambled our defences. Anti-tank guns were rolled into position. A single armoured car idled near the entrance to the valley. We prepared a welcome party, but the enemy never arrived. Perhaps they had turned into the hills. Then came word from intelligence. Our paratroopers had landed at Corinth. Fallschirmjäger Regiment 2, under Oberst Sturm, was already engaged. And now, with our foothold secure, the trap was closing. The last British escape route was under fire. And we were there, on the far side of the Gulf, because we had crossed it before anyone told us to. We had all felt the shift before the orders came. There was a strange tension in the air that June, something beyond the usual drills and forced marches. But when the broadcast came through, Hitler's voice booming over the radio, even the veterans among us stood still. He spoke of a final war, a crusade against Bolshevism, a righteous strike to end the world menace. Some cheered, others were quiet. I just felt cold. It was the 22nd of June, 1941, and we were stationed in Gaia. The shockwave of the attack on the Soviet Union raced across every rank like a fire through dry straw. For a moment, the ghosts of our fathers loomed behind us, those who had bled and died in the fields of Galicia, in the icy wastes of the East. We were marching into their war now. Only this time it would be worse. On 27th June, our battalion left the Czech lands and moved east, pushing past jubilant crowds waving flags in Olmütz, Ratibor, Beuthen. Some tossed flowers, others shouted blessings. But I saw the fear behind their eyes. They knew what war with Russia meant. They remembered the Red Flood from 1919. We crossed the Vistula near Anopol, and by 30 June we were at the Soviet frontier near Usyalug. The mood grew grim. The cheering had stopped. Already the news was coming in fast. Our armoured divisions had punched deep into Russian soil. The Führer's elite, our own Leibstandarte, had been raised to full divisional strength and assigned to Army Group South under Field Marshal von Rundstedt. Their orders were clear: strike for Kiev, crush the enemy west of the Dnipro. With them were 26 infantry divisions, 4 Jaeger divisions, 4 motorized, and 5 Panzer divisions. The sky belonged to Luftflotte 4, commanded by General Oberst Löhr, but the Soviets were no paper tiger. Marshal Budyonny had over 40 infantry divisions, 14 motorized, 6 armoured, and 21 cavalry divisions braced against us. And they were not retreating without a fight. On the 1st of July, we reached Rolban Nord at Wuk and felt the full resistance of the East for the first time. The Russians fought with a kind of animal tenacity, no finesse at all, but ferocious will. Every village was contested, every crossroads mined, every field booby-trapped. On the 2nd of July, new orders reached us: advance on Rauno via Kleven and establish contact with the 3rd Army Corps under General von Mackensen. The radio traffic was grim. Rumours were already spreading that the Corps had been surrounded. Red Army formations were bleeding through our flanks, emerging from the Pripyat marshes like phantoms. I remember staring down at the map, trying to make sense of the chaos. The old certainties were gone. There were no front lines, just fragments. One village might fly the Reichskriegsflag, the next would hold T-34s waiting behind hedgerows. I stood before my men and tried to explain the situation. After fumbling for clarity, I simply told them, as of today, the enemy is everywhere. And though I didn't fully understand it at the time, it was the absolute truth. Just east of Wuk, we came across the outermost line of an infantry battalion. Smoke curled above the trees from a smouldering tank wreck. The road ahead vanished into dense pine forest, the kind that swallowed sound and played tricks on the eyes. We had 60 kilometers to cover if we were to reach Rono and break the encirclement. Time was everything. I gave the signal to move. At the head of the column was Fritz Montag, grey-haired, mustached, a veteran of the trenches in the First War, now leading our motorcycle scouts in the 1st Company of the SS Reconnaissance Battalion. I watched his column pull forward, wheels rumbling over the dirt road, and something in my gut twisted. I wanted to call out, to tell them to slow down, to warn them the forest ahead was not just a barrier, but a trap. But I said nothing. My lips stayed shut against the dry wind. The road narrowed into a gully between tall trees. Burned-out trucks and tanks littered the margins. In one clearing, we spotted a dozen T-26, camouflaged and seemingly abandoned. They had been left behind without fuel, ghosts of a retreating regiment. Then the lead platoon disappeared ahead. A flash, a burst of fire. One of our armoured cars opened up with its 20mm cannon. The bushes had come alive. 4, 5, maybe more. Soviet light tanks sprang forward from the underbrush and began firing. Our men dove into ditches as tracer fire tore through the trees. The ground shook under the dual roar of our pack guns and the Russian 45s. The air was full of bark, metal and splinters. Within minutes it was over. The tanks lay burning beside the road, painting the night in firelight. But the fear lingered, sharp and unspoken. By 1930 we had fired our first real shots of the war. There would be many more. I dispatched a combat recon force southward via Olica to link up with the battalion at Kherson, and sent word to the rear to stay alert. That forest still haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. The night deepened. The road became a tunnel of darkness. Near the village of Stovek, we passed through a winding track flanked by heavy forest. At midnight, just as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, a truck cut across the path ahead, then another. Their silhouettes were wrong, not ours, Russian. Without hesitation, our Kradschützen opened fire. Machine gun bursts lit up the trees. Screams, explosions. Several Soviet trucks burned like pyres at a forest junction. The heat was overwhelming. The woods, once silent, now howled with fire and gunfire. The atmosphere turned eerie. I had never known fear like this. Not in Poland, not in the West. This was different. The Russians didn't fight like us. They fought like ghosts, striking from nowhere and then vanishing. The forest itself seemed to side with them. Every movement, every shadow could mean death. We pressed on, hour after hour, pushing eastward. Kherson was still over 30 kilometers away. We halted just before the tree line opened. Flares were rising from the direction of Kherson. You could hear the distant thud of artillery. Somewhere out there, our comrades were still holding on. We didn't know it yet, but the real nightmare hadn't even begun. As we neared the edge of the woods, the trees thinned slightly, but the tension did not. The road twisted like a snake, and the forest seemed to whisper around us. Just ahead, flares burst into the sky from Kherson, bright green and white arcs painting the heavens, then fading. It was close now. We could hear the hammer of machine guns and the rhythmic thunder of artillery. Our comrades were still in the fight. Just as we were about to press forward, a scream tore through the column. Grenades exploded behind us, then the unmistakable sound of tank tracks grinding steel. I turned and saw it. A Soviet tank, perhaps a T-34 or a BT-7, had somehow slipped into our column during the night. In the chaos and darkness, we had mistaken it for one of our own prime movers. It now accelerated, crushing motorcycles and sidecars as it veered left into the tree line and vanished. Moments later, another tank emerged from the dark and repeated the madness, crashing through the rear elements before anyone could react. We had been moving through the forest shoulder to shoulder with the enemy and hadn't even realized it. My blood ran cold. I shouted for every man to dismount and prepare for engagement. Somewhere to the left of the road, more tank silhouettes flickered through the trees. My combat reconnaissance unit, which had gone south toward Olica, was now in contact with elements of the 3rd Battalion, SS Infantry Regiment 1. Their radio message crackled with urgency. They were under heavy pressure and possibly encircled. The 12th Company had been surrounded and was calling for help. We turned the column immediately. There was no time to lose. The Russians were fighting not for honor or position, but to cut off and annihilate. We moved quickly, rifles slung tight, each man grim with focus. Soon we reached the embattled 12th Company. The Russians were trying to overrun them in a sea of tall cornfields, pushing forward in thick lines. Our timely arrival, backed by a single armored car, turned the tide. We fought them off, barely. The cornfield was littered with bodies. The Russians had thrown everything into the assault. Their discipline was chaotic, but their courage was unquestionable. With the position secured, we resumed the march and entered the village of Klevan. Smoke rose from smouldering buildings, and the streets were lined with burnt-out trucks. Dogs barked somewhere in the ruins. We pushed past the rubble and took the eastern road out of the village. Ahead, it descended into a long valley before rising again outside the small hamlet of Brniki. That's when I saw it. On the slope ahead, amidst the soft green grain, was a shape, a pale, unnatural brightness against the earth. I raised my binoculars. There, half sunken in the field, lay a light field howitzer, abandoned in position. German. It was our own gun, silent, stripped, and left like a carcass. Just beyond it stood an ambulance. The doors had been torn from their hinges. Blood streaked the sides. The interior was ripped apart, equipment scattered like bones. No sign of the wounded, no sign of the medics. I gave the order to halt. We dismounted and approached on foot. Each man was silent, rifle held low. We crested the hill and then stopped dead. Before us, under the full gaze of the morning sun, was a horror that turned the stomach. They were German soldiers, at least 20, maybe more. All stripped naked, laid out like cattle. Their hands had been bound behind their backs with wire. Every man had been executed, some shot, others mutilated. Eyes stared upward in frozen terror. A few had their throats slashed. One had been decapitated. Several had crude symbols carved into their chests and bellies. The officers, God help them, had been given special treatment. Their bodies lay separate from the others. One had been run over by a tank. Another's face was so disfigured we couldn't tell who it had been. Pieces of them were scattered over the slope. Someone had crushed their skulls under boots or rifle butts. It was an act not just of murder, but desecration. Not a word was spoken. No one dared. Helmets came off instinctively. We stood in silence, surrounded by death. Even the birds seemed to fall quiet. There was a holiness to the stillness, a recognition that this was not war, but slaughter. One of my corporals knelt beside a corpse. His hand trembled as he touched the shoulder. He didn't know the man, but it didn't matter. This could be any of us, and it would be. I turned to my men. They looked to me for guidance, for orders perhaps, for answers, but I had none. I met their eyes one by one, and then I turned away. There was no speech to give, only the road ahead. We buried them with what time we had. The soil was soft. We covered their naked bodies with cloaks, jackets, even leaves. Some of the men said prayers, others simply stood watch. Then we moved on. We continued toward Rauno, and for days we saw no further enemy. But we all knew that the moment had changed us. The war had shown its true face. This was not the West. This was not France or Belgium. This was the East, and there would be no quarter. The days that followed were a blur of sweat, dust, and sudden violence. By 7th July we were dug in north of Rauno, fending off wave after wave of Soviet attacks. Their infantry came on in human waves, poorly coordinated but ferocious and unrelenting. They screamed out as they charged, sometimes drunk, sometimes silent. We fired until our barrels glowed red. The air reeked of cordite, blood, and unwashed bodies. They were throwing everything at us. Our casualties remained low, but only due to experience, steel nerves, and the sheer brutality with which we responded. We'd all changed. The men who once joked in the rear columns no longer smiled. Everyone kept their weapon within arm's reach, even in sleep. At 1400 hours, we received orders to move again. The situation on Rolbar Nord was becoming critical. The 11th Panzer Division had advanced toward Zhytomyr and Kiev, but in doing so, its flank was left exposed. The 25th Motorized Infantry Division was now under heavy pressure from enemy forces striking from the north. If the Russians broke through, the entire lifeline of our corps would collapse. We were ordered to reconnoiter northeast from Miropol and support the flank. Intelligence, what little we had, suggested a sizable Soviet force gathering near Romanov, motorized battalions, artillery batteries, and several tanks. We advanced into the forest belt cautiously. That night, the forest swallowed us again. The darkness was suffocating, the kind that seemed to press down on the chest and tighten your throat. Our anti-aircraft section took a direct hit just past midnight. A single shell found its mark and tore through the gun crew. We pulled the survivors out as they screamed for morphine. There was no time to mourn. The entire front line was cracking. The Russians were everywhere. It didn't matter how far you advanced, you were always surrounded. On the 9th of July, our orders changed again. We were to strike north from Romanov, cutting through the forest and establishing contact with Kradschützen Battalion 25 near Sokolov. It would be a dangerous maneuver, fast and exposed, but essential to restore contact and prevent isolation. I decided to launch a full motorized assault. We couldn't afford a plodding infantry advance. We needed shock and surprise. I positioned the 1st Motorcycle Company behind a low rise, engines idling. The roar of two 88mm guns echoed behind us, positioned on either side of the road, their barrels already sighted on the tree line ahead. They would provide our opening salvo, cover fire to punch a hole in the Russian lines. At precisely 17:30, the assault began. The 80s roared like thunder gods, hurling steel into the trees. The forest erupted in fire and smoke. The earth shook. Then came the engines, the high, shrill scream of dozens of motorcycles. Sidecars bounced on the rutted path. Men crouched low over handlebars like beasts of prey. Faces locked in grim focus. No one shouted. No one broke formation. I watched as the entire company surged over the rise and plunged straight into the inferno. Leading them was Fritz Montag, my veteran from the First World War, now back in his element. His machine weaved between trees and craters as though pulled by instinct. I saw him raise his pistol briefly before vanishing into the smoke. We had built the assault like a hammer blow. The motorcycles were not meant to stop. They were to crash through, sow chaos, and break the Soviet line. The rest of the battalion would follow, mopping up resistance and exploiting the breach, and it worked. Within minutes, our men were deep in the Russian rear, firing as they rode, throwing grenades into trenches, shattering machine gun nests. The Russians were caught completely off guard. Many of them fled without firing a shot. We pushed hard through the forest, deeper and deeper, until trees gave way to a clearing, and in that clearing stood dozens of abandoned trucks and field kitchens, tents still fluttering. We had burst into the enemy staging area. I dismounted and moved among the wreckage. Half-eaten meals were still warm. Maps were left scattered on tables. Boots, rifles, even personal letters lay strewn in the mud. Whatever unit had been stationed here had broken and run, but the forest gave no peace. To the east, another Russian counterattack was forming. Our flank was once again threatened. We turned and moved fast, the motorcycles screaming through the trees, tracers buzzing overhead. Another firefight erupted at the edge of the forest, short, vicious, and loud. By nightfall, we had linked up with elements of Kradschützen Battalion 25 near Sokolov. The men there looked like ghosts, filthy, exhausted, but alive. Their commander, a captain with bloodshot eyes and a 3-day beard, gripped my hand and said only one thing: we thought no one would come. We didn't sleep that night. No one even lay down. Instead, we sat in silence around the vehicles, drinking what bitter coffee we had, checking weapons, listening for movement in the trees. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It was wired with tension, like the breathless moment before a storm. By dawn, word came down the line. The 11th Panzer Division had pushed past Zhytomyr, continuing its advance toward Kiev, but its flanks were now stretched so thin they were practically threadbare. Soviet reinforcements, fresh from the interior, were being thrown forward in great waves. Their supply chains might have been primitive, but their manpower was endless. The order was simple, but deadly: advance northeast, link up with scattered friendly units, and destroy whatever Russian forces we encountered. We were becoming more than just scouts now. We were the knife tip, slicing forward through brush, smoke, and chaos. I briefed the men as best I could. No flourishes, just what they needed to hear. We're going forward. No guarantees. Watch the woods, watch the skies, and watch each other. Once again, our motorized column surged forward. Bikes revving through the morning mist, armored cars grinding down the narrow roads, machine guns trained on the tree line. The men had learned not to speak much. They scanned every shadow, every tree stump. We knew now what the Soviets were capable of: ambushes, false surrenders, mass graves, and worse. The air stank of pine sap and diesel. Somewhere ahead, artillery rumbled. Each time the road opened up, we saw smouldering wrecks, shattered T-26, flipped trucks, half-burned supply wagons. At one crossroads, a lone Russian Maxim gun sat abandoned on its tripod, surrounded by empty belts of cloth-fed ammunition. A tin can still steamed nearby. Whoever had manned it had run just moments before. We moved cautiously, recon elements spread wide. Then, contact. It started with a single shot, then 3 more in quick succession. Then the tree line came alive with muzzle flashes. I dropped to the ground behind a ditch as tracers cut through the air above. Our lead motorcycle squad was pinned down ahead. One sidecar already burning, the others stuck in a storm of Soviet fire. We couldn't advance on wheels, not here. "Dismount!" I shouted. The order rippled down the line. Men scrambled for cover, dragging MG-34s and Panzerbuchse forward. I crawled up to a fallen tree trunk and scanned the edge of the forest with binoculars. Russian infantry, at least 2 companies, were firing from concealed positions behind brush and low ridges. Their accuracy was crude, but their numbers made up for it. I signaled for flanking fire. A few minutes later, our armored car opened up from the left flank with its 20mm cannon. The explosive shells tore into the forest like claws through wet paper. Screams, splinters, movement. Now we advanced, foot by foot, crawling from cover to cover. The forest sucked us in again. I fired my carbine until it was hot in my hands, then switched to grenades as we cleared dugouts and shallow trenches. The Russians began to break. Some fled, others stayed behind to die. One of my men, a 19-year-old from Hamburg named Kohl, stood over a wounded Russian and hesitated. The man was bleeding heavily, one leg gone. I watched as Kohl lowered his rifle slightly, only for the wounded soldier to draw a pistol from his coat. It was instinct. I fired before Kohl even flinched. The Russian slumped over, dead. Kohl stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once at me. No words. None were needed. By midday, we had cleared the pocket. The bodies were everywhere, twisted in grotesque shapes, sprawled across the forest floor like broken puppets. We collected weapons, ammo, and any documents worth sending up the line. One sergeant found a blood-stained Soviet map marked with red grease pencil arrows, clearly intended for a flank attack on Zhytomyr. So this was the game now, not just defense, but deception, delay, encirclement. The Soviets were adapting, and quickly. Our advance resumed that afternoon, but the mood had shifted. Even the veterans looked tired now, eyes sunken, shoulders hunched. The weight of constant battle was beginning to show. I saw men dozing off standing up, their boots caked in mud, hands still wrapped around their rifles. One of our trucks threw a piston outside of a burned-out village. We towed it as far as we could, then stripped it for parts and left it behind. Fuel was running low, food even more so. We were living off captured tins and hard black bread. No one complained. Around dusk, we passed through a small village that had seen recent fighting. The wooden houses were riddled with bullet holes, the church roof blown off. A horse lay dead in the square. I dismounted and entered one of the homes. Inside, a table had been set for dinner. Cutlery, bread, a still full bowl of cabbage soup. The family had vanished. Gone before the battle. Killed in it. Fled. We'd never know. Outside, one of our medics leaned against a wall, smoking. His face was blank. "They don't even scream anymore," he said. "Not the Russians. Not the civilians. No one does." I nodded, too tired to speak. We moved on. The morning after the forest engagement, we received new orders. Hit the Soviets again. This time it was a motorized attack north of Romanov to link up with Kradschützen Battalion 25 near a place called Sokolov. The forests up there were dense, unyielding, soaked with summer rain and shadowed by smoke. Every path seemed to lead into a trap, and yet we had no choice. Rolban Nord was threatened. If we didn't hold the flank, the entire corps could be cut off from behind. I studied the map in silence. There was little to see. Just forest. Endless, choking, green-black forest. That was the battlefield now. Not cities, not open plains. Just trees and mud and fire. Before the assault, our 88mm guns opened up with a tremendous roar, shaking the earth, tearing branches from the tree line, and sending plumes of dirt skyward. The smell of cordite mingled with the sap and damp bark. It was time. Bremer's motorcycle company launched first, their engines howling like wild beasts as they tore down the road. I saw Fritz Montag's sidecar hit a bump and lift clean off the ground, before crashing back down and continuing forward, dust trailing behind them like smoke. They raced into the forest like madmen. The 80s fired again, shells ripping into the woods ahead. And then, just like that, the forest swallowed them whole. We followed fast, half-tracks, armoured cars, sidecars, all charging headlong into the unknown. Bullets cracked from the tree line. One machine gun opened up with a sound like ripping canvas. Another burst from the left, nearly catching a sidecar mid-turn. But the momentum was with us now. Speed was our only defense. Then, just as quickly as it began, we were through. Bodies of Soviet riflemen lay sprawled on the roadside. One still clutched a drum magazine for his PPSH, the weapon we'd learned to hate and admire all at once. I picked it up as I passed. The thing was filthy, caked in grime, but still functioned like new. It had jammed less in one firefight than our MP40s did in two. More and more of us were taking them now, not as trophies, but as tools. Effective, brutal tools. One of my men, Kessler, had even sanded down the Russian star on the buttstock and carved a crooked iron cross in its place. He called it his Russian devil. "Reliable little bastard," he muttered one evening, cleaning it with oil-soaked rags. "I'd trade 2 MPs for one of these. Holds more rounds, never jams, and the Soviets know how to make a weapon that survives in shit." He wasn't wrong. Even our logistics officers had taken notice. Some units were issuing captured PPSH-41s with converted magazines so they could take our 9mm rounds. A few of the more daring armor crews were tossing their MP40s entirely, replacing them with captured submachine guns for close-quarters fighting. The Russians had designed it for peasants. Crude, simple, but deadly, and we had come to respect it. That respect didn't mean mercy. Later that evening, after pushing through another burned-out hamlet, we found a Soviet observation post, abandoned in haste, scattered papers, a half-empty bottle of vodka, and blood trails that led into the woods. Our translator combed through the documents. Most were worthless, but one, neatly folded and stuffed into a jacket pocket, contained names, perhaps of captured German soldiers, perhaps of executed ones. We didn't speak of it. In a nearby field, the Soviets had left their dead, dozens of them. Young men mostly, some barely 18. Their faces were pale, their limbs splayed in awkward angles. Some still had their fingers curled around rifle barrels. Others had no fingers left. One soldier, a corporal named Brenner, looked over the scene and whispered, "We're going to need more shovels." Another, younger, asked him, "To bury them?" Brenner looked at him, eyes hollow. "No, for what's coming." By nightfall, we had dug in along a low ridge just south of Sokolov. The men were quiet. Some slept in shallow holes. Others sat staring at the stars, rifles across their laps. The woods beyond the ridge were alive with sounds. Distant shouts, the rumble of engines, the occasional bark of gunfire. The Soviets weren't done. They were regrouping. I sat with Montag and Bremer near the armoured car, drinking lukewarm coffee from a tin. No one spoke for a while. Then Montag, eyes locked on the dark forest, muttered, "It's like they don't feel pain, like they just keep coming no matter how many we kill." Bremer lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "It's not that," he said. "It's that they're fighting on their own soil now." We knew he was right. For the Russians, this wasn't just war. It was home. It was vengeance. And that meant it was only going to get worse. That night, we received word that another unit, a battalion from the 25th Motorized Infantry, had been overrun just northeast of our position. Survivors reported seeing Soviet T-34s punching straight through their flanks, infantry swarming like ants behind them, PPSH guns chattering from every angle. Our lines were bending, and if they broke, we'd be the first in their path. We cleaned our weapons in silence, repacked our gear, and tried to get a few hours of rest, though none of us truly slept anymore. Our dreams were filled with smoke, fire, and the shrill stutter of Russian submachine guns, and tomorrow we'd go back into the forest. By morning, our ridgeline position was soaked in mist, the kind that clings to skin and muddies every step. Bremer was already awake, pacing along the trench with his collar turned up and cigarette smoke trailing behind him. The men were mostly silent, a few hunched around stoves warming up what passed for breakfast, some chewed without tasting. At 0630, orders came. Push through Sokolov, regain contact with the battalion to the north, expect enemy armor, expect resistance. We weren't surprised. We rolled out slowly, carefully. The woods ahead were thick and wet, the kind of terrain where tanks moved like ghosts and where the PPSH roared before you even saw a silhouette. Our armored cars led the way, flanked by Kradschützen weaving through the trees like hounds sniffing for an ambush, and they found one. The first burst came from the right. A Russian soldier leapt from behind a birch tree, his PPSH already firing, the 7.62mm rounds spraying like a garden hose on full blast. One of our sidecars veered hard left. The driver slumped forward before it crashed into a tree. "Contact! Flank!" someone screamed, and then the whole forest erupted, the PPSH. That sound, a vicious, metallic buzzsaw, cut through the trees from all directions. It was deafening, disorienting. We ducked low, returned fire, but the forest itself seemed to shield the enemy. Private Meyer hit the dirt next to me, dragging his wounded leg. "I never want to hear that damn sound again," he groaned, blood soaking his trousers. "It's in my ears. I swear it's in my chest." He wasn't being dramatic. Every man in that forest learned to fear that sound. There was no warning, no build-up. 1 second the world was quiet, and the next you were pinned by a weapon that could spray an entire platoon in seconds. We eventually cleared the ambush. Flamethrowers helped. So did grenades. But not before 3 more men were down, and one of our half-tracks burned like a bonfire behind us. We found the attackers. Most were conscripts, some barely out of school, but every one of them clutched a PPSH. One of our NCOs, grizzled and bloodied, stood over a dead Russian with 2 drum magazines still strapped to his chest. "They're giving these things to everyone now," he muttered. "Kids, farmers, militia, doesn't matter. You get one of these and suddenly you can pin down an entire squad. Not fair." That same day, a radio message crackled in from the rear. Logistics had secured a batch of modified PPSH-41s with 9mm conversions for distribution among reconnaissance units. Officially, sanctioned, issued. We weren't just capturing them now. We were using them like our own. By the time we reached the edge of Sokolov, a good third of the men in my company were carrying Russian weapons. Some slung them across their backs. Others had even fashioned pouches for drum mags, using bits of captured Soviet gear. One Feldwebel, a veteran from the Poland campaign, scoffed at the idea at first. Then, during a close firefight, his MP-40 jammed. He tossed it aside and grabbed a dead Russian's PPSH. Later that evening, sitting on an overturned crate, he said, "You know what? I was wrong. The damn thing works. The bolt feels like it's from a tractor and it looks like it was built in a shed. But it works. Fast, deadly, and reliable." We secured Sokolov by nightfall, or what we thought was Sokolov. There wasn't much left. Just the burnt husks of homes and a graveyard torn apart by artillery. The Soviets had pulled back, but not far. We heard them, digging in, regrouping, maybe calling in armor for another push. I stood by the road with Montag, looking at the smouldering remains of a captured supply truck. A dead Russian lay nearby, his face gone, but his fingers still clutching a battered submachine gun. Monday bent down, picked it up and wiped away the blood. "Add another to the collection," he muttered. I turned to him. "You're not afraid it might jam?" He laughed, dry and tired. "No, I'm afraid it won't." That night we counted our dead, 11 men, 3 wounded so badly they wouldn't walk again. More than half our motorbikes were damaged, and one of the armored cars had taken a direct shell hit. Still, morale was strangely intact. Why? Because we were still alive, because we had broken through, because for all their numbers and weapons, we were holding. But deep down, we all knew something had shifted. The enemy wasn't crumbling, he was adapting, he was multiplying. And now every peasant boy we faced carried a weapon as good, sometimes better, than ours. In whispered jokes, the men called it Stalin's gift. In private, they prayed they'd never face a full wave of them again. The forest had given way to open ground, not clean or orderly, but scorched and carved up by artillery fire. Trees that once lined the road to Zhytomyr stood like skeletons, shattered by shells. Somewhere ahead, Soviet infantry was massing. We could hear them, even when we couldn't see them, shouted orders, engine rumble. The distant crackle of machine gun fire followed by that same rattling, unmistakable hiss, the PPSH again. By the 12th of July, our company had been pulled into a defensive screen along the road south of the town. Our orders were to hold the corridor, no matter the cost, and keep the link open between our forward armoured elements and the retreating 25th Motorized Infantry Division. No one said it, but we knew we were about to get hit. That evening, as we dug in, I passed along the trench line where the men were sharing cigarettes and tightening helmet straps. In their eyes, you saw it, the veterans' look. No talk of glory, just preparation. Bremer crouched next to a sandbag emplacement, running his hand over the cool metal of his captured PPSH. "I cleaned her out," he said, "stripped and oiled. Better than my old MP40 now. Feels wrong, doesn't it? Using their weapon." "Feels necessary," I replied. He nodded once. "Yeah." The first attack came just before midnight. Sudden, vicious, a wall of sound and fire. Soviet artillery lit up the tree line, and out of the smoke came figures, dozens at first, then hundreds. The first wave was poorly armed, rifles, grenades, but behind them, you could hear it, like bees in a bottle. The PPSH men, our MG42s, opened up. Grenades soared. But the Soviets kept coming. They moved like they had no sense of death, as if the winter mud itself had pushed them forward. Corporal Lindner was manning a light machine gun on the left flank. I saw him stand up, yelling over the gunfire. "They're all carrying them. Every damn one." One of the Russians had gotten close, too close. He emerged through the smoke with a PPSH blazing, and in seconds Lindner was torn open, stitched across the chest plate cracked, eyes wide. The machine gun fell silent. Private Vols, barely 19, scrambled over, grabbed the MG and fired blindly into the fog. He didn't cry. He didn't scream, just clenched his jaw and kept firing until the barrel glowed red. By morning, we had pushed them back, but only just. The ground in front of our trench was littered with spent drums and the twisted bodies of Soviet infantry, many still gripping their PPSH-41s as if death hadn't loosened their hands. I picked one up. The weapon was scratched, coated in frost and dried blood, but functional. It felt heavier than it looked. A simple machine. Crude by our standards, but that was the danger of it. It needed almost no training. Just pull the trigger and it vomits bullets until everything stops moving. One of our replacements, a Bavarian named Eckert, was watching me. "They make these in factories that build tractors," he said. "Factories we bombed," I replied. He nodded slowly. "Didn't seem to matter, did it?" Number, it didn't, because by now the Red Army had turned every town, every school, every shed into a production line. By July, they were building over 3,000 PPSHs a day. That number was more than we could comprehend. It meant every man we faced could be armed like a stormtrooper. The next day, we scouted forward. Dead Soviets were everywhere. Some were teenagers. Others looked like old peasants. But all of them carried the same gun, the same curved drum magazine, the same cold determination. We reached the remains of a burnt-out defensive position. Among the rubble, a Soviet diary. I had it translated later. "Received PPSH today," one entry read. "Heavy but powerful. They say Germans fear it. I hope it keeps me alive." He hadn't survived, but his weapon had. We took it back. Another addition to our pile. We were collecting them now, not just for curiosity, but for use. Our ammunition supply was drying up, but the Russians had plenty of 7.62mm to go around. It made sense. War often isn't about pride, it's about survival. That night we heard them again. The distant drum fire, short bursts, controlled, closing in. The Red Army wasn't retreating anymore. It was learning. The lakes west of Saselya shimmered under the August sun, their edges still and silent, but we all knew what they meant. Protection on one side, a trap on the other. The village stretched along the water like a tired animal. We had taken it the day before without a shot fired. The last Russian troops, remnants of the 162nd Infantry and 5th Cavalry, had vanished eastward by midday. We found red banners draped from the church rafters and grain piled where sermons once echoed. The belfry stairs had likely gone up in flames during the last winter, chopped for firewood by the desperate. An old, toothless man with cloudy eyes introduced himself as the village priest. He asked for permission to hold a service, the first in years. I nodded. As he stood before the congregation, voice trembling with age and emotion, tears ran down his cheeks. The old folk wept too. The young ones stayed outside, unsure what to make of it all. That day I saw a kind of quiet reverence I had not witnessed since the war began. It didn't last long. That night the horizon to the west lit up with artillery flashes. The 16th Panzer Division was smashing into Nikolajev. At dawn, I climbed the church tower and scanned the countryside. Vast wheat fields rolled outward in all directions, broken only by dusty tracks that ran into the village like the arms of a spider. Dust clouds stirred in every direction. Russian aircraft circled low near Novopetrovka, landing, taking off, watching. We were surrounded. I didn't need a briefing. I'd been in too many pockets to need one. Our Kradschützen had just started their morning routines when we spotted a Russian column rolling in from the west. At the same time, Soviet units emerged from the east. They had no idea we were there, not yet. They strolled right into our engineer platoon's trap on the dam between the lakes. It was over in minutes. Not a single shot fired. The whole column was captured. I turned the church tower into my command post. From there, I could see everything. More Russians appeared from the direction of Shawanka, slipping into the cornfields, man-high stalks, thick and green, perfect for concealment. Company after company vanished into the waving crops. It didn't faze me. Only one narrow strip of corn touched the village perimeter. The rest of our field of fire was clear, a 400-meter open kill zone. I knew what would happen next. Artillery batteries rolled into position on the horizon. I watched their silhouettes against the pale blue sky, tracked their messengers riding through the black soil. But we didn't open fire. Ammunition was precious. Our supply lines stretched impossibly long, and every round had to count. I waited. The moment would come. Small black dots appeared in the distance, marching steadily through the wheat. The sun struck metal, bayonets, helmets, and they glinted in the heat haze. Russian infantry, well-spaced, disciplined. They dragged anti-tank guns with them. The horses had been left behind. A smart move. I studied them like a chessboard. Then I called up the weapons I knew would bleed them the fastest. I ordered our forward lines to remain hidden. Caecilia had to appear abandoned. Quiet, still. Only the heavy platoons of the motorcycle companies remained visible. Everything else was pulled back north and south of the village, waiting for the order. At 11 o'clock sharp, I gave the signal. Our fire erupted all at once. MG bursts ripped through the corn. Mortars arced overhead and dropped into the Russian formations with hollow thumps. Infantry guns barked like thunder. Gaps opened in their line instantly. Bodies dropped. Commissars screamed at the men to keep moving. A few rose and charged, but most hugged the ground, pinned by sheer volume. That's when the Kradschützen and armoured cars hit them from the flanks, encircling and driving them toward our guns like livestock in a slaughterhouse. By noon the field was littered with corpses, and 650 prisoners stood under guard. One of the captured officers told us the commander of the 962nd Rifle Regiment had executed his own staff before shooting himself. The unit had entered with 900 rifles. By our count, over 200 were dead. The rest, shattered. Not long after, the Red Air Force found us. Waves of aircraft screamed overhead, machine gunning the road and dropping bombs into the tree lines. Our AA gunners responded in bursts, bringing one of the low flyers down near the water's edge. But we took losses. In the afternoon, enemy artillery began pounding the village. Shells fell west of our position. I had expected another attack, but what came next was faster and heavier than we anticipated. Soviet motorized forces came barreling in, armoured cars, amphibious tanks, using the cover of dust and wreckage. Our battery took a direct hit. An ammunition truck exploded in a flash of orange. Still, we let them come close before firing. One amphibious tank was blown clean into the air. the chassis twisted like paper. Our Panzerjäger moved out like predators, cutting into the Russian columns at point-blank range. One of our tank destroyers was hit. Flames erupted from the driver's hatch. The man was still alive, screaming as his skin burned. His comrades pulled him from the inferno and beat the flames out with blankets. He was blackened, blind, begging to be shot. The doctor did all he could, but there was no hope. I couldn't look him in the face, couldn't say anything. I just turned away and gave him a final salute in silence. That night, the smell of burning fuel and scorched flesh clung to everything. We held Caselia until the 17th of August. Patrols pushed as far south as Snigirevka. Our armoured cars reached the train station by nightfall. The town beyond it was still crawling with Soviets. SS Untersturmführer Teder's car was hit by an anti-tank round. The crew made it back, but Teder, who'd just learned of the birth of his first son that morning, was missing. Meanwhile, the 16th Panzer captured the harbour at Nikolaju and forced the Russians back across the Bug toward Cherson. In the port, our grenadiers found an enormous 36,000-ton battleship still sitting in the docks, not yet launched, a prize for someone else. Then we got the order, recon in the direction of Cherson. 60 kilometers of broken roads and enemy ambushes lay ahead. We moved out before sunrise on the 18th. The sky burned red as the sun rose above the Dnipro. Our columns kicked up clouds of dust along the winding tracks. Ahead, Kradschützen covered the route, flanked by 2 armoured cars. I followed behind with the command vehicle and Hauptscharführer Erich leading the way. I trusted him more than any man alive. We ran into a Soviet supply column seeking a river crossing. They surrendered on sight. No shots fired. Their trucks were still functional, so we commandeered them on the spot. The prisoners looked relieved. Grateful even. Their war was over. Tomato fields stretched on either side of the road. My men started plucking them without orders, eating on the move. Further down, vineyards and fruit orchards flanked the river, but the fruit wasn't ripe. Didn't matter. The men grinned like boys at a market fair. They knew this wasn't a reconnaissance mission. Not really. We were heading straight into something much bigger. Officially, the High Command called it a coup de main, a quick strike, a bold surprise attack. But this wasn't a whim. This kind of operation couldn't be ordered from above. It had to be led by men on the ground who knew the terrain, smelled the wind, and trusted their instincts. The best commanders weren't issuing commands from a bunker. They were among us, bleeding, sweating, thinking 3 moves ahead. That's what made it work. By late morning, the skyline of Cherson appeared in the haze. The grain silos loomed like watchtowers. The tall chimneys of the industrial quarter stabbed upward against the blue. We hadn't washed in days. The promise of water, of shade, pulled us forward like a mirage. I stood atop the lead-armoured car and watched the city spread out before us. The Dnipro glittered like broken glass. Ferries moved slowly across the river. Gunboats darted between them. We watched from a distance, our fingers resting lightly on triggers. Cherson was close now, almost within reach. And it wouldn't be handed to us. We'd have to take it. Cherson shimmered in the sun like a dream, or a trap. The grain silos stood tall, casting long shadows over the docks and shipyards. The Dnipro glinted in waves of silver and white as ferries glided lazily across the water, offloading crates and soldiers. I watched it all from the turret of our armoured car, one hand on the binoculars, the other on the rim of steel. Every instinct in me was alive. The enemy didn't know we were here, not yet, but that would change soon. We halted just outside of the city, in the cover of low trees and bramble hedges that lined the fields. The air smelled of dust and ripe fruit. It was hot, stifling, but no one complained, not now. The grenadiers were crouched beside the vehicles, checking ammunition, whispering to each other, wiping sweat from their brows with trembling fingers. They were veterans, most of them, but even they felt it, the quiet before the plunge. I sent scouts ahead under Hauptscharführer Erich. He moved like a wraith, low, fast, always alert. An hour later, he returned with information. Soviet forces were thin in the western districts but thick along the docks. Roadblocks had been set up near the administrative centre. Anti-tank guns guarded the bridges, and small boats were ready to ferry men and supplies across the Dnipro. But they weren't expecting an attack from this direction, not yet. They thought Nikolaev was still holding us up. I smiled. That was all I needed to know. We moved into position just before noon, taking a circuitous route to avoid the main roads. Vineyards and broken paths led us around the enemy's eyes. A farmer's donkey brayed at us and was silenced by a quick boot to the hind. We passed through groves of sunflowers, taller than a man, the seeds drooping, heavy with late summer. Everything looked so peaceful it made your stomach twist. The assault began without trumpet or signal. Just one sharp command into the radio, and all hell broke loose. Our forward armored car punched into the western district first, machine guns blazing. The enemy was caught completely off guard. Soldiers scrambled from buildings with half-eaten food still in their hands. One Red Army man bolted from a hut with a frying pan still in his grip. He didn't make it 10 meters. Our MG fire tore him in half. Grenadiers poured in behind the cars, taking doorways, alleys, stairwells. One of my men, Feldwebel Candler, took a round to the throat while trying to kick in a cellar door. Blood fountained from his mouth as he collapsed in the dust, eyes wide, still clutching his submachine gun. I dropped beside him and felt his pulse fade under my fingers. He was gone in seconds. We pressed on. Resistance stiffened as we neared the center. Soviet troops fired from windows and rooftops. Snipers picked off 2 Kradschützen from a balcony near the grain mill. The first took a round through the helmet. The second tumbled backward, his body flopping like a puppet cut from its strings. We returned fire with everything we had. Panzerbuchse, grenades, high-explosive rounds from the armoured cars. The building went up in flames, but we didn't stop to watch it burn. We made it to the docks by mid-afternoon. That's when the real fight began. A Soviet gunboat opened fire from the river, its cannons booming across the water. Shells slammed into the street, throwing earth and bricks skyward. One explosion blew the tracks clean off an armoured car, sending it spinning like a crippled beetle into a fruit cart. The crew scrambled out. 2 of them burned, one of them screaming that he couldn't see. His eyes were gone. A shard of glass had taken them both. I ordered return fire, not just at the boats, but at the ferries too. We couldn't let them evacuate. Our gunners focused on the waterline. One ferry was hit mid-channel. It flipped sideways like a wounded animal, men spilling into the river like dolls. Some swam, others sank. There were no survivors by the time the current carried them under. We pushed into the final block of the harbour district. Resistance was chaotic. Pockets of Red Army men defending isolated buildings, sometimes fighting to the last man. One commissar blew himself up with a grenade rather than surrender. We found his remains scattered across the stairwell of a warehouse. By 1800, the western half of Cherson was in our hands. We set up makeshift defences that night, unsure how long we'd hold it. The men were dead tired, covered in soot and blood. Some leaned against walls, smoking in silence. Others rifled through Soviet supplies for water, food, and cigarettes. I found a crate of tomatoes and passed them around. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small act of mercy after the slaughter. In the distance, across the Dnipro, we could see Soviet reinforcements gathering. Trucks, columns, searchlights. The river wasn't a wall, it was a mirror, and they were preparing to strike back. But for now, Cherson was ours, and we would make them bleed for every inch they wanted to take back.